Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. I'm going to open this episode with an attempt at a summary of everything so far in one or two word bites. I could add to each of these an IYKYK. If you know, you know, but here we go. Butterfly effects. When. Time. Relativity. Know now. I. Consciousness. Multidimensional. Self. Empathy. Evil. Suffering. Atheism. Polytheism. Monotheism. Pantheism. Panentheism. Or, put another way, I guess, a summary might say this. I see my life as part of an entangled cosmos in which places and times and people and things and events are not isolated individual entities or realities. In this cosmos, empathy and reality are intrinsically connected, and empathy, with a big E, is somehow personal. I believe in the divine, as mysterious as that is, but it is also a cosmos laced with stunning beauty and threaded with astonishing suffering. And I don't know how to explain the latter in light of my convictions about big E empathy, big R reality, and the divine. It took me 33 episodes to conclude that panentheism is the only theism that enables me, at least, to hold all of that together in one bundle, which still leaves me with the question about suffering and evil. To clarify, that question is really twofold. How and why did it ever begin, and why is it allowed to continue? I'll circle back to the first question about origins later. I'll first look at how my understanding of panentheism might respond to the question, if empathy is an aspect of ultimate reality, then why is evil and suffering allowed to continue? And that requires me to look more deeply at panentheism. But first, let me revisit my definition of empathy, especially big E empathy. And this is how I have defined it. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person, essentially, quote-unquote, walking in their shoes. It involves both cognitive understanding of another's perspective and an emotional response to their feelings. True empathy goes beyond simply acknowledging someone's feelings. It involves connecting with them on a deeper level, feeling what they are experiencing. So empathy is connective, and it's inherently collective. Empathy connects myself deeply with other selves. Empathy collects other selves with myself. That is why I think that quantum theories of entanglement may be a way to describe the empathy this empathy that I'm describing, at least, in the language of science. Empathy and entanglement, the essence of all reality in a cosmic sense. Empathy as a reality, both in physics and as a psychic reality. I frequently reflect on how this view of reality leads me to wonder at the beauty and mystery and goodness and love that I observe and experience. But again, what about the evil and the suffering that I have kind of gone out of my way to describe in the last episode or two? Let me explain something about a piece that I want to share here. My wife, Susan, recently crafted a poetic prose reflection, which, though she was not connecting to my podcast when she did it, I think profoundly expresses this dual reality of beauty and brutality, goodness and suffering, love and cruelty. As a result, I think her poetic prose channels something of the sort of empathy that I've been talking about. So I asked her if she would read her reflection called "You Are As Close to Me as My Tears." And here it is.
You are as close to me as my tears. You are as close to me as my tears. Tear by teardrop you are with me. As the fullness courses down my cheeks, courses across my heart full to exhaustion from carrying so much heartbreak. trying with poor success to ease my ache through kettle chips and canned pina colada. To carry the weight of my people on these frail shoulders is too much. Daughters and their disappointments, precious grandchildren, my own failings, no guaranteed outcomes, all too much. Drowning in sorrows. Is there enough strength in me, in these aged bones, to keep on stepping forward one step at a time, after a lifetime of sorrows? And yet the sorrows are entangled with joys. I must not forget the joys. These joys have been beyond words, beyond the sorrows, beyond the tears. These joys have names and faces that are engraved on my heart and soul, seared with fire and tears and love. I would not exchange the sorrow for the joy. If one must be, so the other can be, then so be it. My heart is as a plate of tangled noodles, sorrow and joy and longing and hope, all existing alongside one another, each somehow dependent upon the others. Mysteries, miracles, all are mine. How to distinguish between sorrow, tears of sorrow from tears of joy? They course down my cheeks and across my heart just the same. Tears that are as close to my heart as you.
Susan's way of expressing an empathy that embraces everything expresses how I also see divine empathy. But I am, as often is the case, getting ahead of myself. So, first, back to a little more detail about panentheism. First, some review, and then I'll get into more detail. As I've mentioned before, the term panentheism is constructed by combining several Greek terms: pan, all, en, as en, not in, but meaning in, and theos, God. Thus, panentheism is something akin to all-in-Godism. Panentheism also works the other way, theos in panism, or God in all-ism, if you will. Panentheism is the view that the cosmos is in God and God is in the cosmos. For some, this is a way of combining pantheist and monotheistic worldviews. In monotheism, God and the cosmos are ontologically distinct. They both really exist. The beingness of God is external to the beingness of the cosmos. In pantheism, God and the cosmos are ontologically identical. Only the divine really exists. The beingness of one is the beingness of the other. God and the cosmos are not ontologically entangled. They are, to repeat, ontologically identical. Panentheism holds together the beingness of the cosmos and the divine in a different way than either of those. The beingness of the cosmos and the beingness of the divine are not external to each other, nor are they identical with each other. They are interconnected, entangled in such a way that it is better to speak of the interbeingness of both rather than the beingness of each of them. Now, I need to dig deeper to prepare for the implications of all of that for the questions about suffering. So, panentheism and then some of my questions. The theisms dance between the absence of the divine, atheism, the transcendence of God, monotheism, and the divine immanence, pantheism. Panentheism says yes to both immanence and transcendence. At the ontological level, isness, the cosmos and the divine, exist in interbeingness. Now, what I want to go on to say here is that there is an existential level, the level of what I would call the divine experience of interbeing. Panentheism leads to questions as to whether the divine is influenced by, even changed by, whatever connection there may be between natural and spiritual reality. That question does not arise for the other theisms. So obviously in atheism, there's no divine being for the cosmos to influence. And in pantheism, the evolving, changing, emergent world is not affecting the divine being. It is the divine being simply being itself. In monotheism, the divine being is external to the processes of the cosmos and exists in its own unchanging, immutable self. Monotheism also tends to assume some form of divine plan, which determines the course of things from the outside. In the prior episodes, I've already explained the problems that both the pantheist and monotheist views present when answering why suffering and evil continue. In summary, basically, it's because in both, the divine is ultimately responsible. I won't repeat all of that here, but instead I want to focus on how Panentheism, affects this, differs from those two. Panentheism, similar to monotheism, affirms that the divine is not equivalent to or coterminous with the natural world. The divine being is itself. In keeping with pantheism, Panentheism says that the divine is also immanent within the natural world, within being the key word. The divine is present in the cosmos, and the cosmos present in the divine. And this is true to such an extent that the divine is even affected by, and in some way changed by, what happens in the natural world and in the decisions of sentient beings, such as ourselves. Quantum theory in physics resulted in a shift from understanding the cosmos as a mechanism to seeing the world as a complex, entangled, emergent process. In panentheism, God is always working from within the processes of the cosmos, entangled, connected, in union, responding, creating. Panentheism affirms the interbeingness of divine and cosmos, and that implies some form of interdependence between God and the world. And it's this latter point, which for me is the aspect of panentheism that suggests a way forward relative to how I can face the mystery and reality of evil and suffering, while continuing in my convictions about the mystery of big E empathy being an aspect of big R reality. That's not an obvious conclusion, so I need to say more. How does that idea that I have work? In an earlier episode, I presented texts from the Christian heritage as examples of a religious approach compatible with panentheism. I'll refresh some of what I described at that time and add a little more detail here as well. There are several portions from the Christian sacred texts that we could examine, for example, from several of the letters of Paul. But for this episode, I'm going to focus on just a few portions of the Gospel of John. The first portion is from the opening verses of John. I will present my translation of the Greek text of chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to present it first, clause by clause, using both the Greek and the English, in order to try to at least make somewhat clear the way that I see this unfolding. And then I'll give the full sentence in English. So here's the first clause. In arche hen hologos. In the beginning was the Word. Kai hologos hen pros ton theon. And the Word was towards God. Kai theos hen hologos. And God was the Word. Houtos ein in arche pros ton theon. This one was the beginning. This one was in the beginning towards God. So putting that together as one sentence in English, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word, which is the one that was in the beginning towards God. John is describing in a sort of looped form there the inner being of the divine, and it's an interbeing. There is a towardsness in the very nature of the divine, according to John, a word left mysterious and undefined that is towards God, and yet God is that word that is towards God. Or, I think it is fair to conclude, John sees the divine nature not only in terms of interbeing, but as interbeingness itself. The wider context of John's writings provide more texture. For example, he makes a statement that God is love and suggests to me that the towardsness that we've noted is another way of speaking of divine love as an ontological reality, as an aspect of the isness or beingness, the interbeingness of the divine. Big R reality is in essence, then, towardsness, love, and thus, in my view, big E empathy. If empathy is defined as experiencing the experiences of another as if I am that other, then empathy is also the experience of our interbeingness. This is the theism part of panentheism, the God part. What about the pan or all part? John goes on to say, and again I'll use a couple of Greek clauses followed by English and then try to put it together. Panta diautou egenita, all things came to be through him. That is, through this God who is the Word that is towards God. So we have the theism and the pan, everything, parts of panentheism. What about the in part? John also adds this clause, in auto zoe hen, in him was life. In him, meaning that God that is the Word towards God. Life, all of life, life itself, the nature of what it means to be alive is in the God who is the Word which is towards God. Life is in the interbeingness of the divine. Life is in the divine love, according to John. John would have assumed a creation event, of course. That's why he says, came to be. It's a starting point, which is John's assumption. Yet the reference to life being in him suggests that John sees life as an ongoing unfolding of the life that is in the divine interbeing. So that is pan and in and theism, panentheism. A few verses later, John says that the God which is the Word that is towards God, John writes this, I quote, became human and lived among us. John does not say became a human in the singular, but became flesh, embodied, entered into a state of interbeing with flesh, with humanness, and so with physical reality. That means when we take the text together, that all of life, the life of the cosmos, is in God, which is the Word that is towards God, and the God that is the Word towards God, which became in the cosmos through the process of dwelling in physical human reality, became human in that, became intertwined with the entire cosmos through the process of dwelling in physical human reality. Now, John's subsequent story does focus on one specific human, Jesus. But early Christian thinkers recognized a universality precisely in that specificity. In the words of Athanasius, for example, God took humanity, not just a human, into God's very being, which is where I see the divine empathy and the experience of suffering enter the picture. For as the story unfolds within the life of this one person, the historical experiences of Jesus, the suffering of the world is also experienced in various ways. So, for example, according to the Gospels, this is some of what Jesus experienced, and therefore what John would have said, the Word which was towards God and God who is the Word that is towards God would have experienced this by taking on flesh, taking on the experience of humanity. There's early childhood trauma as a refugee fleeing the homeland under fear of being searched out and killed. There's grief and loss, tears at the death of a loved one. There's the pain of betrayal by a close friend. There's the pain of denial and abandonment by another close friend. There's the pain of false accusations and lies. And finally, there's the pain of being falsely convicted, tortured, and killed in a brutal, painful execution. All experienced by a human being, but also experienced by the divine in the reality of the mysterious interbeingness of the divine and humanity. It seems to me that one obvious implication of what John is saying about the embodiment of the divine is that God experiences suffering, not secondhand, not as compassion or sympathy, but from the inside, as God's own pain. In the divine interbeingness shared with us and with the cosmos, for all of life is in the divine and is experienced by the divine. This is my understanding of big E empathy. Now, there's still some big questions. One of those is, well, is suffering ever going to end? If panentheism is true, then the divine being is not external to the cosmos, is not controlling it inexorably towards a predetermined end. Panentheism suggests that the future is not predetermined in that way. For if the divine is entangled with the cosmos and experiences evil and suffering and is interconnected with the ongoing cosmic process of change and becoming, then the future is open. And any number of possible outcomes or scenarios may come to fruition, even if the divine has already taken those into account. If the divine is intertwined with the entire cosmic process of emergent unfolding development, then is there any hope that evil and suffering will ever end in any final, ultimate sense? And on what basis might we have hope for such a better future? My own answer to this has two sides to it. First, what I call the preternity of the divine. I made up that word by combining pre and eternity. With monotheistic heritages, I do believe that the divine being exists prior to the cosmos, thus that the divine nature, including empathy, predates the cosmos, as it were. And so although the cosmos is cosmically entangled in an emergent cosmos, the preternity of the divine nature provides an ontological grounding for an essential nature of all that exists, an essential nature characterized by, among other things, empathy. This suggests to me that ultimately things will become what they truly are from their beginning. Second is what I would call the post-ternity of the divine, which you may guess I made as a word from post and eternity. And I use it to indicate that the ontological reality of the divine is also never-ending. And thus, if the divine nature is essentially big E empathy, this suggests to me that nothing out of keeping with that divine nature will ever continue forever. This seems like a good place to try to express all of that as an artist. I set one of my poems to music some time ago, titled Starting Again. It expresses the hope for a transformed world in the future. And though written quite a bit prior to the podcast, it weaves together the human and divine as actors in the process of transformation, even though I might articulate that differently now. I've heard that long ago you promised never to ruin this world in rain. And I've read that before the rainbow all the world's dreams had drowned in vain. When I see the world we've made, I can't help wonder, if it's true, then maybe it's time for a different way, for you to start it all again. We've soaked the dust with blood, shed the blood of children in their schools, painted with blood on the canvas of human skins, written our history in blood dripping from a million hands, a million faces in leering grins, blood crying from the ground and asking when the time will come for you to start it all again. I've heard the dream that someday a city with streets that burn like gold will drop down from heaven and drive away this aching cold, with leaves of healing and a river of life that swells and flows, though the dream doesn't tell us how or when we will awake to find that you've begun to start it all again. I wonder, what if instead of us waiting for the dream, it's the dream that's been waiting for us, waiting down all the broken, shadowed years for all of us to come awake and start it all again. Perhaps that last stanza brings together the way that a panentheist view of an entangled cosmos, in which the divine and human are in a real sense co-actors, can finally result in a new future. But meanwhile, what difference does this all make? And let me start again with a brief summary. Panentheism means that, one, the divine is not defined by and equated with the evil and suffering I see, which is pantheism's answer. And two, the divine is not external to it all, allowing it to continue even though able to intervene and choosing not to, and that's monotheism. And three, the divine being shares in the experience of the suffering and evil that we experience, and that means that meanwhile suffering and evil continue. And they continue in the process of an entangled cosmos in which the thoughts and actions and emotions of one affect the thoughts and actions and emotions of others. There are butterfly effects, both good and bad. Panentheism suggests that the divine being is also in this. It's all entangled with the interbeing of everything, including the divine. So what difference does that make? Two things, as I see it. First, in panentheism, the divine being experiences the suffering with the cosmos, with us, with me. And while this doesn't provide me with answers as to why that all happens, it at least portrays a divine being that is not detached or removed from and untouched by our suffering. Honestly, knowing that some version of divine interbeing, interconnection, shared life, and union with the suffering that exists is the only way I can hold on to theism at all at this point. This is the only view that allows me to continue to believe in any kind of a theistic worldview. And that makes a huge difference to me because I do believe that. But is that all? There's a second way that a panentheist view makes a difference to me. I suggested above that the pre-ternity and post-ternity of the divine empathy gives me hope for a transformed cosmos in the future. Let me add one more element to that. Going all the way back to episode 1 and butterfly effects and the difference that even human empathy can make cosmically, I'm convinced about the how much more this might be true of divine empathy. There's a sense in which, by taking suffering into big E empathy, we all participate in the cosmic process of transformation. There are, frankly, Buddhist ways of speaking of this. There are also ways rooted in the New Testament. The latter suggests that there are divine butterfly effects and a divine way of metabolizing evil, so to speak, and suffering, a divine way we can participate in or can cultivate that whole process. And so I have hope that through the cultivation of empathy, in connection with big E empathy, ultimately everything will existentially become what its ontological nature is. In other words, I have hope for a future in which empathy and love will win. Well, okay, but how do I know? How did I become persuaded about all this? Why do I believe this? And honestly, it is not through a pure process of deduction and logic. I'll just say that right here at the outset. In fact, I doubt there is such a thing as a pure objective process. We know things and know the world and know each other and know ourselves and know place and time and consciousness through many different instruments. Western philosophy and science both depend, in my view, on a far too narrow spectrum for the colors of the rainbow of knowing and truth. My conclusions are the result of experiences and intellectual reflection and imagination and intuition and logic and deduction, all sorts of things. I'm also beginning more and more to think that hope is a way of knowing. Hope involves imagination. Hope flows from deeper sets of values, things we wish were true of the world, things we are actually sometimes, to some degree, committed of making true of the world and of ourselves. All of these ways of knowing get mixed together, and sometimes they combine to corroborate each other inside of me, and sometimes they correct or challenge one another inside of me. Now, I know my explanation for how I know what I know won't satisfy everyone. It doesn't satisfy me every day either. But as of today, this is where I stand. Now, what about that other question? I asked early on in this episode the question about the origins of evil and suffering. Every religious heritage has a way of understanding both the nature of evil and suffering and also aspects of the origins or sources of it. So, things like ignorance and delusion, craving and desire, rebellion and disobedience, self-centered hubris, non-human intelligent evil. I've found wisdom and insight and value in each religious heritage's views of all this. But none of them actually answer fully the how and why of the origins of evil and suffering. Let me just give one example, and it comes really from my own original heritage. And for the sake of brevity, I'll just focus on what Western religious traditions might refer to in some way as a personal evil, a spiritual reality that tempts and incites others to evil and causes evil, and thus is involved in proliferating suffering. In other words, to use the sort of slang way of talking about it, the devil made us do it. But why was such a force allowed the freedom to choose and act in those ways? There isn't really an answer to that. It just is. And I see all the heritages in a similar way relative to this question of why. Why are things set up to allow suffering, whatever way we may understand it? And I don't think ultimately there's an answer. In fact, I said at one point a few episodes back that I would end up saying, I don't know. And, well, this is that point at which I'm saying, I don't know. Well, now what? My reference just now to how different religious heritages offer answers speaks to a topic I've been wanting to cover even before I began the podcast. I've been wanting to talk about how I view the religious heritages of the world, what I gain and glean and appreciate, and also what I question and even reject. I say in every introduction to the podcast that this is an exploration of humanity, the world, and the divine. And I'm actually coming to the end of that journey, at least the end of the road that I think this podcast will cover. There is a lot more to explore, and I plan to continue to do so in several different venues and formats. But I plan for the next episode to be the final installment of this journey and to focus on the things I gain and glean and appreciate, and the things I question or perhaps reject from the different religious heritages of the world. So I'll say more about all of that, my approach to religions, and what I plan to do next time.